Welcome to the Unstuck Church podcast, where each week we're exploring what it means to be an unstuck church. While the broader data shows that the church overall is in decline in North America, there are indications in our research that many churches are seeing a significant increase in health and growth. On this week's podcast, Tony and Amy continue our series on the differences between stuck and unstuck churches, with a conversation on why some churches are not in decline. Before we get into today's episode, I want to tell you about an upcoming opportunity we have specifically for senior and lead pastors. Our newest senior pastor cohort kicks off October 15th through 17th, and registration for it closes on August 15th. During the year-long cohort, you'll connect with senior pastors from 8 to 12 like-minded churches to explore the critical responsibilities that senior pastors own in larger, growing churches, and to actively participate and learn from each other. To learn more and register, just go to the unstuckgroup.com/senior pastor. Now, before we get into this week's episode, here's Tony with this week's podcast sponsor.
The 6 Types of Working Genius is the fastest way to increase productivity and morale on your team. This 10-minute assessment gives you a custom report about why certain work frustrates you while other work energizes you. When you do it with your team, you'll immediately understand how to better leverage each other's geniuses. You'll see better decisions, higher retention, and productivity without burnout. So get started at workinggenius.com and use code UNSTUCKWG, that's UNSTUCKWG, for 20% off.
Well, welcome back to all of our listeners. We're in week 2 of a great series called Stuck or Unstuck, and we're talking about why some of them are actually not in decline, like we always hear in all the reports and things that we read. But before we dive in, Tony, hey, it's great to see you. I know we've both been on the ground week after week. Usually summer slows down, but that is not my case right now. How about you?
I have been traveling, I want to say, for the last 4 or 5 weeks. Now, some of that consecutively, some of that, there was a bit of a family vacation in there. But otherwise, I've been on the ground serving churches, and I know you have too, as Amy. Where'd you say you just came back from Pennsylvania? Is that right?
Well, I was in Pennsylvania. We just actually had our follow-up call today, and just such a great church, Believers Church out there. I actually just got back from Boise, Idaho, and let me think, St. Charles, Missouri. And let me just tell you.
By St. Louis, yeah.
It's really hot in America. I'm glad to be a Minnesotan. It was 55 degrees when I woke up this morning. I was so glad to be home.
Well, Amy, you're right. We're in a great series, and it's really the focus is primarily on why is it that some churches are not stuck?
Right.
And, the reason why, I mean, it just seems like the surveys and the data reported in the media always repeat the same refrain. Church attendance is in decline. Religious participation is phasing out of American life. And I trust the research. I don't doubt that is happening when you look broadly at churches and society as a whole. And because of that, though, I wanted to have some confirmation of what the experts are seeing in the research. And last week in the first episode, I had a fascinating conversation with Alan Cooperman of Pew Research Center, and we did a deep dive into the status of religious life in America, and that really was fascinating. I loved that conversation, but that kind of sets the conversation for where we're going to be going in these next 2 episodes.
Yeah, I'm excited for this now. That was such a great backdrop. Loved hearing what Alan had to say. But over the next 2 episodes, we're going to try to explain what's so different about unstuck churches based on real life examples and give you some practical ways to make sense of the things contributing to church growth or to church decline. So let's kick this off today, Tony. Let's just start. What do you think is the core tension that we're exploring in this episode?
Yeah. So, Amy, as we look at the data we're collecting at the Unstuck group, it's the trends are different than much of what we read about in the general research, which again says something different about the churches that are engaging with our content and participating in our surveys. And I think because of that, people are surprised when they read our reports for the very first time. As an example, in our most recent edition of the Unstuck Church Report, the average year-over-year attendance increase was 17% across churches of all different sizes. And it's just contradictory to what you would see and maybe assume is the case for all churches. And I trust that's the case. There's clearly something different about the churches engaging with our surveys. And despite the headlines, we do know that there are hundreds of churches that they're not in decline. In fact, I would say they're actually thriving in this current season. And just to give some more specifics to this, we also know from that most recent research that in the church, not only were the churches experiencing attendance growth, but they were seeing more people cross the line of faith as well.
Yeah.
In fact, again, this is the average of churches of less than 100 to churches well over 10,000. And what all of those churches experienced on average was 14% of their average attendance. These were people that actually said yes to following Jesus by indicating either a decision, a salvation decision, or actually going public with their faith through baptism. So again, 14 out of every 100 people in these churches are meeting and beginning to follow Jesus. And I love that. And it's, Amy, I mean, we were just mentioning it. I mean, just about every week, you and I, and then the rest of our team are in different churches across North America. And just this past week, I was at a great church, and I always like to brag on the churches that are experiencing health and they're thriving right now. So I want to brag on Victory Church. It's in the Philadelphia area, specifically Audubon, Pennsylvania. Amy, are you familiar with Audubon?
No, I just shifted over to Germany.
Oh, yeah, no. No, this is in the U.S., in Pennsylvania. At Victory Church, it's just a fun church because I've had a chance to work with Pastor Ed and the team there for, gosh, it's probably more than 10 years now. But they're seeing the highest level of attendance that they have ever seen. But they, in the last 12 months, Amy, had close to 600 people that said yes to following Jesus. And it's a good-sized church, but it's not a mega church, but they're just seeing all kinds of people take steps towards Jesus. And again, it just points to the uniqueness of the churches that are listening to this podcast, for you church leaders that are listening, and those churches that are engaging with the surveys that we put out on a quarterly basis. So there's something distinctive about churches that are unstuck. They're not really stuck.
Right. Well, Harvester Church, where I was at in St. Charles, Missouri, they had 23% of their average attendance is kids, and 14% of it is students. And those are high numbers. So
reaching young families.
They're reaching young families. Yep. Well, I think we can say with confidence, because we know firsthand it's not all bad news out there. In fact, I know that we have to kind of trust some of the data that's out there, but I always have this skepticism because the view from my seat looks so different with the churches we're working with. So let's actually get down to why that is, Tony. Why are some churches outliers to the data?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in this episode and also in next week's episode. So I'll share a few of the characteristics I see in the churches that we personally know from our work are definitely not stuck. Beginning with this, they have a clear vision and direction. In other words, we've talked about this in the past. There is a clear, bold move that they're pursuing as a ministry. In other words, because they have clarity about this future direction and they've identified their bold move, they have reason to lean on God. So they're not just doing the same thing that they've always done. They're leaning into what God has for their ministry in the future. Because of that, they're not holding on to traditions. And what I've seen, Amy, is when I talk about traditions, especially religious traditions, we probably have in mind this church that's been around for a century, and they're still doing church the way they did church a century ago. But what I know about churches is we get very religious about how we do religion, and it doesn't take very long for us to begin almost worshiping the way we do church. And so we've seen churches hold on to specific ministry strategies, even though those strategies are no longer producing the mission results that they're trying to pursue. So, Amy, let me give you a specific example of what this looks like. And I'm not going to name names of churches. In fact, I'm not even sure it was this specific program, but let's call it a basketball program for kids in the community. We've seen churches, and actually multiple churches. So if this is your church, frankly, we could be talking about dozens of different churches, and it might be basketball, it could be something different. But because so many people are participating in the ministry program, in this case, basketball program, we think that's a win. But in reality, then when we start to look at specifically, because of that basketball program, are people taking steps towards church and faith, then you see the result, the win is the participation in the program, but it's not helping people become more like Jesus and take steps towards faith. The bigger challenge with ministry strategies like this is it still, when you do a program like that, it still takes resources. It still takes people's time, volunteers, leadership, communications and promotions focus, space in our facilities, and not to mention financial resources for programming like that. And so anytime we have a strategy that's not producing results, not only is that a drain on limited resources that churches have, but what it's doing too is pulling from where we could be making investments in our ministry that's actually producing results. So it's it's not allowing us to really invest in the things that God's using to help people take their next steps towards Jesus. Amy, anything you would add here?
Yeah, to what you were talking about, it just opened up a window for me that when we talk about the characteristics of these outliers, the churches that are not stuck and growing, what you're just talking about is a mindset I see them embrace when we bring it up, which is they are not doing things just to draw a crowd anymore. They are evaluating, they're naming what the win is for whatever event it is, whatever program it is. They're naming the win before they invent it, then they hold it and they debrief against that, because it's really about next steps. It's not about attendance anymore when it comes to programs. Tony, do you remember the book that came out by Charles Duhigg a few years ago called The Power of Habit?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. In that book, he writes about these keystone habits, and keystone habits are habits that trigger a series of related behaviors. In other words, one keystone thing that you do changes a series of behaviors that happen. And I think a keystone characteristic of the unstuck churches we serve is that they're just mission-minded. In fact, as you wrote in your book, The Unstuck Church, they hold tightly to their mission, why they exist, and they hold loosely to their methods, how they're accomplishing it. In fact, Chad Hunt on our team, when I've watched him facilitate when he's walking church leaders through our church life cycle, which is also from your book, The Unstuck Church, he talks about churches that are on the left side, that ascending side. He talks about them being people who are focused on loving people. And then churches that are starting to lose momentum, head down the right side of that life cycle, in maintenance. He said those churches are really focused on loving God. Loving God isn't a bad thing, but we've moved from loving people to loving God. And lastly, the churches that are dying or on life support are really focused on loving me. And I love that.
The individual. Yeah. That's good.
I love me. Don't change. Don't change my church. And I love it because I think the keystone characteristic is this mission-mindedness of unstuck churches who are committed to both reaching and discipling people the most effective ways they can. They change their methods when they're not working. So anyways, that is the thing that permeates these unstuck churches, is that they are more tied to mission, more tied to loving people, reaching people, and discipling them than they are their programs or themselves. So
yeah, Amy, that's so good. And as I've expressed in the past, what you're highlighting here is that stuck churches have let the way they do church get in the way of why they do church. And healthy, thriving churches, they hold loosely to their ministry strategies, and they're only going to leverage the strategies that are really helping point people to taking a step towards Jesus and getting on mission with the body of Christ. So I love that. Well, I launched us off with one of the distinctives for these outlier churches. What else comes to mind for you, Amy?
Yeah, I think this is an important one. Outliers, I believe they have clarity about their spiritual formation or their next steps. In other
Hmm.
words, they don't just have a bunch of programs, but rather they've developed these clear next steps that they want all believers to take. And outliers have a leader that's over those next steps so that they all work together instead of competing with one another. And because of this, their church calendars are not cluttered. They're not trying to do too much. I work with a church right now that's trying to get unstuck. And it's funny, they showed me how they track all of their events. And it's really, really cluttered right now. And the
Yeah.
pastor is becoming more and more aware of that and he's laser focused now on we've got to have a better process for what's going to hit the calendar because if we do too much, we're really not going to accomplish enough.
Yeah. And Amy, what I've noticed with churches and their calendaring strategies is commonly they let fairness be the driver of what gets on the
That's
calendar. And the people that are most efficient in their calendaring get, in other words, they ask for a spot on the calendar or in the facility and in the promotion strategy first. And
Yep.
because of that, they get space. But fairness is not the win here. Helping
Mm-mm.
people meet and follow Jesus is the win. And because of that, we can't just cater to everybody's desire for space on the calendar. We have to
Mhm.
figure out what are the opportunities that are going to encourage people to encounter a living God and making
Mhm.
sure that whatever is going to point people to Jesus gets highest priority then on our church calendars, not just who happened to be first or
Yep.
not just
Yep.
making sure every ministry gets their fair share of the calendar in the coming year.
Okay, so I'm going to build off of that one. Outliers they actually stop working on the ministry in the ministry for a while. They pull back and they start by going, what do we think God wants to do through our church this year? What results do we want to see? And then they ask how we're going to accomplish it. The other side, the stuck churches go, all right, everybody send us all the events you want to have. Everybody
Yep.
send us all the money that you want to have. And then we work on it for a few months and then we just dive right back into the ministry. We don't strategically
right.
think about those hows. Well, and just one last thought on that. I think, and because these outliers are being very strategic about not cluttering their calendar, they aren't creating so much busyness in the church. And so because of that, there's some margin and their people are able to prioritize relationships, prioritize their core next steps and, the things that they need to be doing and taking the action for in their spiritual life. And Tony, I'll just mention this, we launched a multi-site cohort in April. And last week, you weren't able to be on the call with us. In fact, I wanted to share these results with you. But we had our
No.
first follow-up check-in call. And of course, these are outliers. These are multi-site church leaders who came together because they wanted to lead a more effective multi-site church. Again, holding tight to mission, not methods. And at the top of the call, we asked each team just to share the progress that they made since our time together and what results they were seeing. And one church reported, okay, so they're in the midst, right, of rewriting their bylaws. They're moving their multi-site model to a more identical model. They're clarifying decision rights, and all of that we know is a lot of work. But the results they're seeing, they launched a campus, Tony, in January. That campus has experienced 80% growth since its opening.
My goodness.
And I have to believe it's because of how they're approaching it. Another church, Christ Chapel, I think they're down in the land of Texas. They're in the midst of launching a 5 p.m. Sunday night service to accommodate all their growth. They're calling it, I love this, they call it Sunday morning on Sunday night. And they're envisioning their church to make the change, attend the evening service in order to open up seats on Sunday morning. That is such a love people move, right? Not love me.
Yes, it is.
It's a love people move. And then just a shout out, of course, to a Minnesota church, Riverside Church. Again, they're in the midst of working on decision rights, getting clarity around a few of their multi-site leadership roles. But on August 4th, they opened a third location of their church. And here you go, a core of 400 people. I know where their church is placed. A core of 400 people who are owning the mission with them, and they're taking that church to a new community. So just going back to Chad's words again, they're in loving people mode, reaching new people with the gospel and helping them look like Jesus. And, each of the churches on that call, they are defying the overall trends of the church being in decline and losing engagement with people. And I'm getting all wound up, Tony. So maybe, did I get off track? Is there anything else you want to add?
That's all so good. Yeah, I love celebrating those stories. That fills my heart too to hear about the churches that we're that we have the opportunity to engage with, and just seeing them thrive in this season. I absolutely love that. And I notice you always tend to throw in an example from Minnesota too, so that's great as well. Let me share one more today. So this is one more reason why we find churches that are not stuck. They're the outliers, if you will. And I think it's because churches that are not in decline empower pastors and they empower staff leaders. It's almost as if these churches recognize that God has placed a call on these people. They are uniquely gifted by God in areas to actually help the church thrive. And they're empowering these pastors and staff leaders to accomplish the mission for the church based on the call God has placed on each of these pastors' lives. And there's no doubt about it. I go into some churches, Amy, and it's very evident. The pastor is healthy, the team is healthy, and when you start to unwind it just a little bit, you find out one of the reasons why the team is healthy and the pastor is healthy is because the board, the lay leadership, understands their top priority isn't to provide checks and balances. It's not about accountability, though in reality, that is a piece of their responsibility. They see as their number one job to make sure that they're continually encouraging the pastor, the staff, that they're helping them thrive in their ministry responsibilities, and they're working as hard as they can to keep the church unified and on purpose, focused on the priority of accomplishing the mission of the church. On the other hand, we run into stuck churches, and it's fascinating, and we've shared the data. Stuck churches have larger boards. They have twice as many committees as healthy, thriving churches. There's just a lot more governance. There's a lot more boards and committees trying to make decisions about ministry rather than seeing people engaging in ministry. And in those churches, it's not unusual for the board, as an example, to see their job is to hold the pastor and the staff accountable. Their job is to decide how ministry is going to get done. And it's one of the reasons why these churches are stuck. It's because they're not actually empowering people that God's called into ministry, into leadership, into spiritual leadership to actually lead the church.
I have a great example of that, Tony. I worked with a church, and again, they're doing great work, Pleasant Hills Church in the Pittsburgh area. I'm going to guess it was 3 or 4 years ago. I was on site, so I can't remember if it was pre or post COVID, probably post, but they came to a joint decision, board and lead pastor, like what we're doing isn't working. And they're a mainline denomination in the Presbyterian church. And so they have polity rules that they have to live by. But they recognized, how do we take the spirit of the way that we were suggesting they set up governance and work it within our mainline denomination? And it was such a partnership between the staff leaders and the lay leaders. And they've been working this now for I think 3 years. We just finished up kind of tying a bow on their work, but they are in the right direction now. I think they had a session that was like 27 people, and then they have to have certain committees in the area of grounds and finance, but they have restructured to the concept of a singular board, and they have empowered those leaders now, and they gladly did it. Because I remember when we started, one of the things that the staff said was, I don't know if I report to the pastor. I don't know if I report to this board member. And those, by the way, the people in those lay leadership, they had a lot to offer, but they were just stuck in meetings all the time. So the work that church, and it doesn't happen overnight. We often say the unstuck process might happen in 3 months, but it's not 3 months of work. And some of this stuff, it's years of work to get it right. But they are now, I would start to call them one of the outliers. And this was the issue that really released them to get back to a place, of growing and thriving as a church.
Yeah. And Amy, just step back. Who would prefer to be engaging in life and life ministry, actually helping point somebody else to Jesus, loving on them? Who would rather just say, no, I'm not going to do that. I would rather sit in a boardroom making decisions about stuff that many
Yeah.
times lay leaders, because they have lives, they have jobs, they have families, they're making, oftentimes I should say, making decisions about stuff that they're not aware of all the implications of the decisions that they're making. Amy, maybe that's the reason why at my church I don't want to be on a board. I don't want to do that.
Yep.
I want to be serving in the ministry, just helping point people to Jesus.
Yeah, it's so good. All right. Well, that's probably a longer episode than we usually have, but Tony, what are some next steps? Let's end with that. What are some next steps we can leave church leaders with today related to this topic?
Yeah, it's as if you and I are very passionate about helping churches get unstuck, isn't it? Well, here's the first next step to consider. First, I do think you need to just get honest with yourself about whether or not your church is in decline. And here, I mean, you're not just looking at attendance and giving, but really, I want you to be thinking about how are you engaging people in the mission? And then specifically, are you seeing people say yes to following Jesus? Are you seeing people making those big faith decisions and going public with their faith through baptism? Are you seeing that happen? And if so, that's an indication that you may be one of these outlier churches. But I really think you need to get honest with yourself. And let me just say this: if you are a pastor or a leader, leaders see things before normal people see things. In other words, you may be aware of some questions about what's happening in your church right now that may indicate that your church is in decline, not experiencing the health it should, and you may feel like you're the only one that sees that. If so, that's probably a confirmation that you actually have the spiritual gift of leadership. Because leaders see these things before normal people see them. Secondly, then, you need to ask yourself how you're doing in these critical areas we covered today. Do we have a bold move that our church is pursuing that causes us to really rely on God and challenges us to rally the church to be a part of that bold move? Are you mission-minded? And are you willing to change? Are you willing to stop doing some things in order to do other things better that will help you accomplish your mission? Thirdly, do you have clarity about how you're making disciples? Are people actually taking their next steps towards Christ? And is that really working? And then lastly, is your team empowered to lead the church to accomplish its mission going forward? Is that happening? So 4 critical questions. Do we have a bold move? Are we willing to make a change because we're mission-minded? Do we have clarity about how we're helping people experience spiritual formation? And then is our team very empowered?
All right. What a great conversation today, Tony. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
So pastors often engage our team when they realize their church is beginning to decline, and often when growth is flat or slower than in previous years. At the Unstuck Group, we bring a proven process that helps pastors assess ministry health, clarify the vision God's given them for the future, and then create the team structure and action plans to see that vision through. Simply put, we help pastors identify where God's calling the church to go and then how you're going to get there. And we help the team get moving faster. We do. We have a proven track record of helping churches of all shapes and sizes create healthy growth for more than 15 years. And you can learn how the Unstuck process works at theunstuckgroup.com. If you haven't already, take your staff team through the 6 types of working genius. You'll better understand how to use each other's gifts to get more done. We actually have some people on the Unstuck team who have been certified in Working Genius, and they can help you maximize it on your team. You can get started with the assessment at workinggenius.com and use code UnstuckWG, that's UNSTUCKWG, for 20% off.
Well, thanks for joining us on this week's podcast. At the Unstuck Group, our goal is to help pastors grow healthy churches by guiding them to align vision, strategy, team, and action. In everything we do, our priority is to help churches help people meet and follow Jesus. If there's any way we can serve you and your church today, reach out to us at theunstuckgroup.com. Next week, we're back with a brand new episode. So until then, have a great week.